are. And I said, and secondly, you really don't have an option. You're a Christian, you're supposed to be about peace, that's what we're trying to do. You have to come, whether you want to or not. So they came with their heels dragging. But at the end of the first day, with smiles on their faces, they came up to me and they said, this is the first time we've ever been heard. By the third day, you had prominent Muslim spokesmen openly articulating the need to address some of these problems. At the end, an elder statesman, also a Muslim, said two things. He said, this is the first time in the history of our country that Northerners and Southerners have spoken to one another from the heart. And the second thing he said was that never before in his experience, and he said limited experience, but he had been a diplomat all his life and he was quite old, so the experience wasn't all that limited, but he had never seen such a single concentration of intellectual horsepower as existed on the Muslim side in that meeting. And that wasn't by accident, it was by design. We weren't there to overthrow the regime, we weren't there to abolish Sharia or Islamic law. We were there merely to answer a simple question: what steps can an Islamic government take to alleviate the second-class status of non-Muslims in a Sharia context? And if we could come up with credible answers and we had highly credible Muslim people at the table, this might resonate in other parts of the world, like Nigeria, like Indonesia, where you have similar kinds of tensions. Well, when it was all over, there was a genuine breakthrough in communications between the two sides. What had started out in frosty silence, 4 days later, it was joking and camaraderie. And there were 17 consensus recommendations that emerged. Now, when you ask yourself, why was this meeting so successful when the wounds ran so deep? I think it was because it truly was an exercise in faith-based diplomacy. We began each day with readings from the Bible and the Quran. We preceded each day with a prayer breakfast at the hotel for the internationals and local religious leaders. You know, and then we also, I think more to the point, we had a prayer team that had come all the way from Santa Barbara, California, halfway around the world, whose sole purpose was to pray and fast during those 4 days, praying for the success of the deliberations. So as these deliberations were taking place, you'd see these folks come in quietly on the from the sidelines from time to time, trying to sit down and figure out what needed praying for and going out and praying. And when my vice president for dispute resolution training called me with this idea of bringing a prayer team and asked me what I thought, I said, I think it's a brilliant idea. I can't imagine that people who pray 5 times daily are going to get upset if we bring a prayer team. And they didn't. In fact, all of these ingredients helped people to rise above themselves. And while the Christians bared their grievances just as forthrightly as one would hope for, it was all done in a cordial tone. The whole meeting, the whole 4 days, was very cordial, and despite these wounds. And I think that was in itself a minor miracle. Another element in the faith-based diplomacy, this is very simple, this is not rocket science, but in my numerous conversations with the then foreign minister and the first vice president who ran the country, these would be realpolitik kinds of discussions where we're trying to persuade them that what we're suggesting they do is in their own best interest, but looking for that convenient opportunity to make a helpful reference to the Quran, or how the prophet dealt with such a situation, or what Jesus might have to say about it. And they really opened up. I've never seen a Muslim not open up when you integrate your faith into the discussion, because this is what they're all about. Of the consensus recommendations that emerged, I'll just cite one. It took us a couple of years to put it in place after it was recommended. And we learned a lesson in that, and that is that when you are attempting to do something from the top down, as we were, make sure that you think about the second and third tier decision makers, because we go over there. I've been to Sudan 17 times, and each time we were over there, we'd move the ball down the field, but the instant we left, things froze. We didn't have the resources to be able to have someone on scene all the time. And what was happening is, if the second and third tier decision makers aren't with you, and in this case they thought that what we were doing was probably going to be at their expense, helping the Christians at the Muslims' expense, and when in fact it was really about helping both. they tried to sabotage it. So we had to end run all of that, and it took us twice as long as it should have to get this council in place. But the council, once it did take hold, within the first few months, it had achieved more in the way of practical, concrete measures helping non-Muslims in that society than the churches had been able to do working by themselves for the previous 10 years. Now, one of the reasons that it was so successful was because of the leadership that we had. It took me 5 months to get the regime to agree to accept as a leader of this independent body. You have to remember, this is an Islamic dictatorship, so you just have so much freedom of movement, and the government has to sanction these things. And so not only did they agree to the formation of an independent body, part of whose mandate was to hold the government accountable for its religious policies, but they agreed to leadership on the Muslim side, who had been a constant thorn in their side ever since they'd taken over in a coup back in '89. He himself had been a pioneer of the Islamic movement, but once they did that, he said that was the wrong way to assume power, and had been a constant critic, has a weekly column in the papers, and he's always chastising the government, and he's the only one who can criticize the president by name and not end up in jail. So quite a formidable character. But beyond all that, the regime agreed to take seriously the recommendations of the council, and to their credit, Darfur notwithstanding, which is a Muslim-on-Muslim situation, they've honored that agreement thus far to the tune of more than $500,000 in land and funding to permit the building of new churches, and also to provide restitution for the past seizure of church properties. Well, that's kind of one example. The next one I'd like to move on to is Pakistan, where we've been on the ground for almost 4 years now, reforming the madrasas, the religious schools, if you will, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. These religious schools have quite an illustrious history, which I think most of us are probably not mindful of. But back in the Middle Ages, they were the absolute peaks of learning excellence in the world at the time. And it was only Western exposure to them that led to the formation of our university system. And small things that you don't think about, like funding chairs in a given discipline, or the mortar boards and tassels you wear on your head at graduation, those all came out of the madrasas. And unfortunately, over the passage of time, and particularly under the impact of colonialism, they sought to divest themselves of all disciplines that they identified with the West, that they could identify with the West. And so today you have the vast majority of them that are simply relegated to rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. What we have been, our two goals there have been to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences, but with a particular emphasis, a very strong emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. And more importantly, the second goal has been to transform the pedagogy. And why that's so important, we want to transform it in order to create critical thinking skills among the students. When we first started out, if a student so much as raised his hand in class, he could be punished for disrespect. And what happens now, though, is that these students will memorize the Quran from cover to cover. I'm sure there's even younger folks, but I've run into 12-year-olds who've got it memorized from cover to cover. But the sad part about it is that they really don't understand what it means, because they're memorizing in Arabic, their first language is